Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the next round of HAPS Fund interviews. We'll be talking to our second group of Egyptology students today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Moore. You may recognize me from the What's New in the Ancient World segment that I host with my good friend and colleague E.L. Mazeros. I'm really excited to be helping out with the interviews this year because I was one of the first recipients of a HAPS Fund grant. So I'm really happy to be able to help out and pay it forward. And so I know you're not here for me, you're here for our scholarship candidates. So let's bring out our first interviewee. Hello, welcome to the channel. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where you're studying?
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Paul Verhelst. I'm a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States. And I'm studying Egyptology in the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations Department.
Awesome. Thank you for being here with us, Paul. How did you get into Egyptology?
I think it goes all the way back to 6th grade when I did our ancient history course, and I created like a pylon to the Egyptian temple, which I still have to this day. So I think ancient Egypt kind of took hold of me then, and I got to college and I saw archaeology and Egyptology as a career choice, and I kind of stuck with it to today as a Ph.D. candidate and graduate student.
That's awesome. And that answer just warms my heart because 6th grade is, so I'm an Assyriologist, and 6th grade is where I first learned about Mesopotamia. And I'm still in contact with my 6th grade teacher who taught me about it for the first time. So shout out to Julia Shrihoos at Malibu Middle School. So briefly, what are your research interests?
So my research interests kind of focus around archaeological science. At the University of Pennsylvania, we're really fortunate to have the Penn Museum and the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials as part of the science division of the museum. So luckily I came in a year or two before the center officially opened, but I got to take so many different courses that focused in ceramic, petrography, archaeobotany, zooarchaeology, archaeometallurgy, digital archaeology. So I really just kind of focused on those things and kind of just developed a love for science and what science could show us within Egyptology. And I got to do a lot of fun projects. I worked on looking at ceramic petrography of low-fired bricks from Dra Abu Naga in Egypt. I'm also looking at some bread through archaeobotany project and kind of trying to determine whether if it's ancient Egyptian pharaonic bread or if it's actually late antique bread. So I kind of look forward to doing that once I can get back into the museum and look at objects again in a safe space.
Yeah, I think, we're all hoping that we can get into museums, get back to the objects that are at the root of our research. And there's a let's get this bread joke in there about this somewhere.
Yeah.
You mentioned getting to, so the center opened after you got to Penn. So did you was it cool to be there as this was forming? Did you get to sort of play a role in determining what kind of research would happen?
Not really, but I kind of got to go along for the ride as they developed the center. So I took a course with the center's director, Marie-Claude Boileau, who deals with ceramic petrography and ceramics overall. And she was really the one who kind of got me like stuck into archaeological science. So I believe the center opened up in 2014. So I'd been at Penn for 2 years, and as soon as the center opened, the teaching specialist came, like it kind of became my second home, taking courses with them and learning those things, learning all like the different techniques and things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. For those watching the channel who don't know or maybe aren't familiar with some of the terms around archaeological science, like ceramic petrography, could you tell us a little bit about what that means and what exactly you do with that research?
Sure. So with ceramic petrography, it's kind of taken a deeper view into a ceramic object. So we can look at the object kind of with our own eyes, and we can learn a lot of the information from that. But just by taking a little piece of it, slicing it very thinly and putting it on a slide and putting it underneath a microscope, it's like a new world is revealed to us just from the information there. So we can learn different things about how it was formed, different things about the material it was made out of. And then we can even take a deeper look from ceramic petrography. We can look at scanning electron microscopy, and even get a deeper view, like 1,000 times magnifications, to look at the individual clay particles to see if they're fused together. So like if a low fired mud brick actually was fired, or how high it was fired. So like all these techniques are really just to kind of give a deeper look into these objects, to learn more information about them, which is always there underneath the surface. We just don't know it quite yet.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I personally didn't know that you could see, get a look at the process of firing clay and mud bricks that closely, what kind of fire, how hot it was. So now we get to, the big question that everyone wants to know. What are your specific summer plans, and how can HAPS funding help you with those?
So one thing I didn't mention with my research interest is that my main focus is with remote sensing as part of digital archaeology. And for my summer research, what I plan to complete is a GIS landscape analysis of the Nile floodplain at the site of Abydos, Egypt, which is part of my dissertation research. And I really got into this topic through a remote sensing project I had done in 2014, which looked at a lake that was associated with the temple to the god Osiris at Abydos. And there was so much information about this lake and how it functioned, and even information with satellite imagery of its remnants up into the 1960s. So this lake was just really fascinating. And as I was researching it, I came across more examples of lakes and canals that were built at Abydos and associated with temples. So these lakes and canals were built in the floodplain, and just right next to it on the low desert were the temples that were associated with them. And I thought it would be really interesting that Abydos kind of represents this opportunity to look at how the ancient Egyptians modified their floodplain through these lakes and canals to meet different functions, like agricultural things, transportation, and ceremonies. Ceremonies being extremely important at Abydos with the annual Osiris procession, where the statue of Osiris is taken out of the temple. It's kind of led around this landscape of Abydos, and even perhaps goes on some of these lakes and canals before it goes back home. But a challenge for this is that the Nile floodplain at Abydos has obviously changed over time. Through research, we know that the Nile has moved kind of an easterly direction. At Abydos, it's a little weirdly situated, so it's kind of a northeasterly direction. And so today, the floodplain is about 11 kilometers long, and it seems that in ancient times, the Nile would have been closer to the site. So in order to place these lakes and canals in a more historically accurate landscape, I want to use historical maps, digital elevation models, aerial photos, and satellite imagery within ArcGIS. And from these data sets, I can look for features within the landscapes like old levees, town locations, the field boundaries, especially weird looking field boundaries, that can kind of help indicate where the old Nile channels might have been, and give a kind of indication for the length of the floodplains during different periods of ancient Egypt. And at the same time, these can kind of give a rough estimate of river movement. So the river movement would never have been constant. It would have been different from year to year depending on things like low or high floods. But through this kind of movement rate, I think I can kind of use it with these features to kind of bring back the Nile floodplain to the periods of the Middle Kingdom Egypt and New Kingdom Egypt when these features would have been constructed. And in a pre-COVID world, I would have gone to Egypt and done some ground truthing through auguring to kind of really get an idea if my estimates are correct or not. But for right now, this is kind of a step, I think, in the right direction to kind of create these theoretical floodplain landscapes, to place these lakes and canals in, to kind of understand them and understand their functions within the Abydos landscape. And I think like it's great because the Nile floodplain is so more complex than what I think we sometimes give it credit for. Like we see this green strip and we know it's the lifeblood of Egypt, but we don't really fully give its due. So I'm hoping to incorporate other information to really show its complexity and kind of bring it within the greater landscape of Abydos. So kind of combining the desert landscape where a lot of work has done with the floodplain landscape where a lot of work can be done. And through HAPS, this will really give me the opportunity to just focus on this. Being beyond funding years, you always have to find some way to kind of support yourself, which I've done through various jobs, but really with this scholarship, I could really just focus on completing my GIS landscape analysis and wrapping up this dissertation and finally completing it.
Yeah, and this sounds like really important work. And I, personally often forget that what the Nile floodplain looks like today is very different than what it looked like, thousands of years ago. And having that information is often just crucial to our understanding of what life around it was like. So I'm curious, you mentioned in a perfect, pre-COVID world, you would go to Egypt to do this. What would that look like? If you could go to Egypt, you could do all the research that you wanted, what would you actually do?
The great thing would just be spend a lot of time in the floodplain. When we excavate on the desert, so we don't get to spend so much time in the floodplain. This would really be an opportunity to work with, fellow Egyptian archaeologists to do some auguring and actually get these soil samples and soil cores to actually kind of look at the differences, see if we can see different layers to really indicate, is there a Nile channel here? Maybe there's old levee, there could be a canal. So pre-COVID, it would just have been spending a lot more time in the dirt and mud in the floodplain to really ground truth and all this information and really center it within more scientifically.
Well, I hope you get to do that one day. You get to go and play in the floodplain. I always refer to research as playing because it's just so much fun for us in a way that sometimes is hard to convey. But we have a few minutes, so we're going to take some questions from the audience.
Great.
Some research. So a sexual atheist asks, what was the biggest surprise in the ceramic photography that Paul experienced? Why was it a surprise?
So with these low-fired mud bricks, I think the thing that surprised me the most was that they were part of a tomb at Dra Abu al-Naga in Egypt, which is kind of a cemetery site across from the ancient capital of Thebes. And what was really interesting was that from looking at the minerals and clay particles and things like that, they don't seem to have been made locally within the area. They seem to have been made further away from the site, which doesn't seem logical. It seems like, these are heavy mud bricks. Why not make them more locally and use them? But it's a really interesting question that, these mud bricks are being made further away and they're coming back, fired at some point, low fired, and then used for tombs. So I think that was the coolest thing, was learning that these aren't local. They're actually coming from somewhere else and being used in these tombs.
Yeah, that's awesome and so fascinating to hear about. And also, I imagine super interesting to come across in your research. I think we have time for one more audience question, if we have them. Yes, okay. What can a better understanding of the waterways on the floodplain give us in terms of knowledge of the ancient world?
So with these waterways, I think, especially with looking at the floodplain today in Egypt and even in other areas of the world, they don't look like they would have in the ancient times. Like with different mechanisms like dams, you can kind of stop the the waters from flooding, especially like in Egypt where the flood no longer happens, so that water and sediment no longer occurs naturally. So we kind of have this idea of like seeing these water or seeing these landscapes as they look like today and seeing them more complex than I think they need to be. I think it could have been a more simpler system. So these waterways didn't have to be so complex. I think the ancient people could have really have used a single waterway for agriculture, transportation, and ceremonies all in one, and really have kind of used that knowledge and their experience to really make a really complex system, but more in a simplified way. And it's another thing with like the waterways is that, again, like we don't think so much of these places where agriculture have to happen. Like we know the fields are there, and then the food comes, the goods go into the tombs, things like that. Mm-hmm. But I think it's cooler to focus on these floodplains and the waterways that, provided the opportunity for them to do farming, to collect raw materials and bring them back to use in their everyday lives.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are just about at time. So is there anything else that you want to add or anything that you want people to know about your research before you go?
I just want to thank you guys so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me on.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. And good luck with your dissertation research. So in order to stay on time for both our applicants and for you all, we're going to take a little break and we'll be back in about 5 minutes with our next interview. All right, hello everyone, welcome back. We'll just jump right into it and welcome our next applicant. Welcome to the Digital Hammurabi channel. Can you introduce yourself and tell us what you're studying?
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Peter Johnson. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. I study the art and archaeology of the Nile Valley cultures, so most commonly known today as modern day Egypt and Sudan.
Nice. Thank you for coming on the channel, for sharing your research with us. How did you get into Egyptology?
Yeah, I mean, super interesting question. I think like many of us interested in the ancient world, I was first kind of lured in by a classics class, the love of Latin and Greek, and just the love of kind of thinking about how people very different than ourselves kind of lived and existed in the world, and kind of came to a realization that even though there is this great temporal and often geographic distance, in many ways are actually very similar to the people we study. So I went to undergraduate thinking I would be a classics major, and had a really awesome Egyptology professor who kind of lured me into the field.
That's awesome. You're the second person who's had an influential teacher in an influential class that sort of steered them into Egyptology, which is just awesome. So briefly, within Egyptology, what are your specific research interests?
Yeah, so I am mainly interested in the kind of cross-cultural exchange between Nubia and Egypt, Nubia being modern day Sudan. And like anyone who's studied kind of that region of the world, Northeast Africa, Egypt obviously looms very, very large. And so I think the other kind of upstream Nile Valley cultures very often get short shrift. And so a lot of my research at the IFA is looking at how we can think about these kind of cultural exchanges in new and innovative ways. So to give you one example, I'm excavating with my advisor right now at a temple site, first millennium BC, that was built in an Egyptian style, but built by a Nubian ruler and in Sudan. And so we're kind of asking questions of how local populations would have engaged with such a foreign type of monument, kind of not assuming that they would view it in the same way that Egyptians would have. So how do these kind of different styles and iconographies move across borders?
And is this something that you see sort of happening a lot? You see sort of Egyptianization happening?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, Egyptianization is a really apt word. It's been used a lot in scholarship. And a lot of what I try to do is ask, what are we saying when we say Egyptianization? Like, where is the power coming from? And can we think of new ways that this cultural network is working? So I specifically ask a lot of questions about how images were viewed in various contexts. Also, a big thing for me is thinking about how the past is written. So specifically, of course, we call it historiography. So who writes the past? What are there certain motivations behind writing the past? And how can we take that into account in writing our own version of the past today? So I think this is especially pertinent in regions of kind of Northeast Africa, where again, we tend to have a lot of power imbalance between Egyptian narratives versus Nubian ones.
So in terms of sources, do you find that like the Egyptian voices sort of dominate this? And I guess specifically, what kind of sources do you look?
Yeah, great question. So the period I work on in the first millennium BC, is traditionally really dominated by, I'll call it Egyptian sources. The Nubians were using an Egyptian lexicon, an Egyptian alphabet to really communicate to us. So when we think about writing a history, we're already kind of privileging kind of an Egyptian language. Furthermore, the style they adopted in their art and in architecture oftentimes, again, was really dominated by Egyptian styles. So one thing I try to do is read between the lines and say, again, why were these people using Egyptian languages, both visual and lexical, to communicate to the world? And what are the areas that are perhaps errant, or kind of where can we look at these mediums to kind of allow access to their own mind sight, knowing that they, of course, did not view the world the same way that the Egyptians did. So yeah, certainly textual are some of the sources I use, but also I'm really kind of object-centered and object-based. So I really love kind of that slow-looking and close visual analysis in my work.
Nice, that's awesome, thank you. The big question that all our viewers want to know is, what are your big summer plans, and how can funding help?
Yeah, so I have a little PowerPoint that I can do. I'm not sure how I can share my screen, but I think I got it. You know what? It's not working, but I can just describe it to you all. I just wanted to, as an art historian, visual elements to, oh, you got it. Oh, good.
Awesome.
Great. So yes, so if you want to go to the first slide, I can just tell folks kind of my project this summer. It's called The Greatest Attraction in the City, New York's Egyptian Museum and the Early American Reception of Ancient Egypt. And I'm specifically doing an archival project. I really love working in archives. I'm based here in New York City. And I am going to be working within the Brooklyn Museum as well as the New York Historical Society, and really kind of looking back to the year 1853, where we see some of the first entry of Egyptian antiquities into New York City and America more generally. This is before the establishment of the venerated institutions that we know of, like the Brooklyn Museum or the Met. And I think this is a really interesting moment in US history, because it's also a moment where the US is kind of entering kind of a world stage and really kind of juxtaposing itself to the European powers of the time. And so people who are kind of familiar with the circulation of these antiquities will likely know that, they entered into European collections like the Louvre and the British Museum in the early 19th century. But they came to the US in very different ways. They tended to be purchased on art markets instead of excavated. And many, I'll call them gentlemen scholars, brought these antiquities to the US. And so, whereas in Europe, you have this kind of tradition of presenting these antiquities of various civilizations in an effort to kind of civilize the public, in the US, the antiquities were kind of presented as oddities, curiosities, attractions. This is a period in the US when you see things like the rise of Barnum and Bailey Circus. You also have a lot of kind of labor rights happening at this time, where people have more leisure time, more money to spend. And so Egypt and this allure of Egypt was very much in competition with these other kind of desires and pursuits. I think this is really fascinating, and something when we think about the history of Egyptology, we tend to focus on kind of their archaeological excavation and kind of this entry into these European museums. But I think this entry point is fascinating, and I suspect, as my research will find, has really kind of colored the scholarship of how they were received, and also how it kind of penetrated into other parts of popular culture. So in my initial research, one thing I've already found is that influential writers and thinkers and artists of this time, such as Walt Whitman, were kind of going to this museum and seeing objects like this for the first time. And then it influenced kind of other arts that were happening, and certainly a kind of cultural scene in New York in the mid 1850s. So my project works to work in these archives to look at which objects were on display, kind of their provenance, kind of where they came from, how they entered into this collection, and then also how was this collection talked about. If you can go to the next slide, unless that's on me. No, you'll see that there are a number of various kind of posters that talk about this exhibition in different ways. I plan to also use news clippings, as I mentioned, kind of look at other artists who attended this museum. Fortunately, the New York Historical Society has a really great register of people who attended, and kind of see kind of what the, again, social life, so to speak, of this institution was for New York. My output is twofold. I would like to publish an article about this, but more importantly, I'm really interested in creating a kind of, I'll call it a digital exhibition for lack of a better word, but a lot of my work works in digital humanities. So I have in the field worked a lot with geodetics and surveying, and I'm pretty adept at geographical information systems. And I'd like to take this information and map it using a program called Esri Story Maps. And it uses kind of same kind of geographical information. And if you go on the next slide, there's an example from another project, not mine, but another one, where you can literally kind of see yourself almost on like a Google Maps or Apple Maps interface and click on various points. You can see photos, you can then see short descriptions. So my idea is to really create a map of kind of what these objects lived in New York in the mid-1850s. Who was part of this milieu? Where are they now? Much of the collection now lives in the Brooklyn Museum, but also some of it has gone on to other collections as well. So I think this is a really interesting point to allow folks to, again, conceive of New York in the 1850s in different institutions that are not just the Met or Brooklyn Museum, and kind of give life to these objects, I think, in a really exciting way, and one that I hope will allow us to kind of think further about what Egyptian art meant during this time period as one which we haven't really yet considered.
This is so cool. This is such a fascinating project, and also very timely as museums sort of go through this reckoning of, returning objects, realize people discovering what they have and how they came about it, and how it's not always the best way to do that. I have just a very simple question. So the New York Egyptian Museum, what sort of happened to it?
Yeah, so it was a private venture by a industrialist, British physician, I think, and his name is Henry Abbott. So it existed from 1853 to 1860, and then it was acquired by the New York Historical Society. And they actually had the largest Egyptian collection in New York for a number of decades, and then realized that they were kind of not well suited to be kind of an art museum. Then they really shifted their collecting focus. And at the time, the Brooklyn Museum was really coming into its own as being a full-fledged art museum, as opposed to one that was created for kind of artistic instruction like many early museums were. So it decided to acquire the collection from the New York Historical Society, and that's where the majority of the objects are today. And some of the archives are there. However, most of the documentary evidence is still at the Historical Society. So those kind of registers of attendees, newspaper clippings, some of the adverts I showed on the screen. So I'm really excited just to kind of work in both of these collections and again, kind of tell a story that I think for many has kind of been lost.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think you have very exciting digging through archives coming up for you. So I know that I have tons of questions, but let's go to the audience and see which questions we have. So Asexual Atheist says, was the Nubian language related to ancient Egyptian?
Yes, super interesting question. So again, as I mentioned, we are kind of at a loss for really understanding how the Nubians spoke on their own terms. We do have a language that is a little bit later than the period I work in. I'd say around kind of 300 BC, called Meroitic. Unfortunately, it is indecipherable. So scholars are actually still working today to decipher the language. However, we do have, again, those ancient Egyptian records, and we can see some irregularities where we can assume, oh, perhaps they're speaking almost in a different dialect. So if folks are looking to get into working with languages in philology, Meroitic is certainly something that needs a lot of intellectual rigor to be deciphered.
I think we've lost Sarah, so I'm going to carry on.
Oh, no.
Hello, Peter. Nice to meet you. We have a second question from Jim Majors, who said, where does Samuel Cox's Smithsonian contribution fall in relation to the earlier Egyptian exhibits?
That's a great question. I am not super familiar with Samuel Cox's Smithsonian contribution, so that's something to look into. I also was very fortunate to hear Professor Alexander Nagel, who is at the Fashion Institute of Technology and also does some interesting related work, and he has found other kind of similar collections entering the US during this time. So certainly this is not an exclusive kind of venture happening in the mid-19th century. But one that I think hopefully will kind of allow us to elucidate this mindset. But thank you for that reference. I'll definitely be looking into it more this summer, as it probably will yield some interesting results.
Have you been finding that some of the stuff you found already is connecting with other archival work and sort of object biographies that people have been doing?
Yeah, certainly. And, I've been really heartened by the amount of work that's coming out, specifically of the UK. There's a book, I believe it was called Scattered Finds, that looked at the circulation of antiquities from excavations into a number of British museums. And so I think there is a real desire to do that in Europe and in the UK. And it's my hope that we can start to kind of have those conversations here in the US. As you mentioned, certainly, I think it's ripe that we start kind of thinking about how institutions work, being really kind of open about provenance and kind of these object biographies.
Awesome. So we have one more audience question.
Sure.
You go. So was ancient Egypt seen as a white space in America?
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? And I assume by white space, we're speaking racially here. And this is something, again, I mentioned that I'm really interested in how the past was constructed and who kind of writes about the past. And so, yeah, a lot of the way that Egypt has been written in scholarship, and especially in art historical scholarship, is as a precursor to what I'll call a Western history or Western narrative of progressivism. And the idea that kind of we today are at the pinnacle and the successive cultures before us, we kind of, did a step up the ladder, so to speak, each rung. And in many ways, Egypt is viewed at the very base of that as a found rock, a bedrock. But often those types of accounts really divorce the kind of our understanding of Egypt within Africa, and it divorces kind of their relationship to other African cultures, which is one of my real main interests, is to look at how Egypt was interacting with kind of African cultures further down the Nile. So was Egypt seen as a white space? Race is a really contested question right now in the scholarship. And when we talk about race, we're talking about a lot of different things: ethnicity, culture, biology. So I would certainly say that Egypt has been constructed as a white space in the scholarship as it exists today. But if we think about race and antiquity, it's not really kind of an apt question.
Awesome. Great answer to a very difficult question. So thank you so much for sharing your research with us. Best of luck with your archival work. I think I speak on behalf of everyone when we can't wait to see what you come up with.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real joy.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right, so we're going to take another quick break so we can start our next interview on time. So we'll be back in about 4 minutes. In the meantime, I'll try and get my internet under control. All right, welcome back, everyone. I can't get physically closer to my router, so hopefully the internet continues to behave. But just in case it doesn't, let's jump right in with our next scholarship candidate. All right, welcome to the Digital Hammurabi channel. Can you introduce yourself and tell us where you're studying?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. So my name is Martin, and I am a Ph.D. student in Egyptology at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And maybe should I also tell you a little bit about my interests, my research interests?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah. So for a few years already now, my research has been focused on a temple in the south of Egypt, close to Luxor. And the temple was built by Mentuhotep II, who reigned over Egypt about 4,000 years ago. And so what I've been trying to do is look at the decoration of that temple. Because at the moment, the monument is actually quite destroyed. It's been excavated at the beginning of the 20th century, and yeah, not much remains of that monument. We know that it's been used as a quarry in antiquity, and so not only of the monument, but also of the decoration, not much. It remains basically. About 3,000 fragments, I think, of decoration have been found, and most of them have actually been unpublished. So that's why I've been focusing my research on those fragments, trying to document them and trying to reconstruct them in their overall decoration scheme of the temple. Because I believe that if we're able to reconstruct the temple, we might actually get to know a little bit more about Mentuhotep II, an interesting figure in ancient Egyptian history, which we don't, or whom we actually don't know a lot about. We know that he was the first king of the Middle Kingdom, but we don't really know how he got to power. So before that, there was not really a king. We had over all of Egypt, we had a period of political fragmentation, but he managed to come out on top and become king over all Egypt, but we don't really know how he did it and how long it took him. So that's why I'm trying to reconstruct the decoration of this temple. Hopefully it will help us with that.
And what kinds of decoration are we talking about? Sort of like paintings, glazed bricks?
Yeah, so this entire temple was decorated in two styles of relief. So we have high relief and sunk relief. So it depends from room to room, really. So in the front of the temple, we had the raised relief, which means that the actual depictions come out, and then the background is kind of like cut away. And then the further you go inside the temple, it changes to sunk relief. So then we have the images that go in, and the background stays the same, basically. And yeah, there are a lot of themes in that temple. So we have battle scenes, which might prove interesting for the political events for the time, but a lot of them are also religious. And Mentuhotep II was actually a king who is very interesting for his religious ideas, because he might have been deified. He might have been very much associated with the god Amun. So I think that reconstructing as much as we can of those scenes, obviously, it's not entirely going to be possible, because the estimate is 3,000 fragments for a big temple. That's not that much. But the more accurate we can go, the better it will be to reply to those questions.
And what got you interested in sort of this mystery of Mentuhotep II?
Well, this started with my MA thesis a few years ago, actually. I was looking for a topic, and I noticed that apart from Dieter Arnold, who wrote a splendid book on some of the relief fragments of that temple, that actually the majority of them to this day remain undocumented and unpublished. And so that's why I started researching a small selection of them. So what I did for my master's thesis is look at 33 fragments that are now in Belgium, where I'm from. I'm from Belgium, and they're being preserved in the Art and History Museum in Brussels there. And so what I tried to do is to measure them, photograph them, draw them, and then try to make reconstructions of them, because what I actually want to know, as I said before, I want to see what the decoration actually looked like. And in order to do that, I had to compare those fragments in Belgium with fragments that are now spread out over museums all over the world. So I have a database at the moment with, I think, more than 1,000 fragments now from 42 museums and private collections, and some of them that are still remain in Egypt, to try and make these reconstructions as accurate as possible. Yeah.
That's quite a database project.
Yes, it has cost me a lot of years. I think I've been doing this for 4 years or something already.
Wow, and you're hoping to amass all the fragments, or is
that would be my goal, because at the moment I'm in the process of publishing those 33 fragments as a start, so I haven't gotten all of the fragments yet, and I know that I haven't gotten all of them because, for example, in the British Museum, there are, I think, 267, if I'm not mistaken, and 54 of them have never been photographed or not online. You cannot really access them. And so that's actually why I'm applying to this grant, because what I would like to do is plan a research stay in London for 2 weeks and specifically look at those 54 fragments, because that would be a major step forward in completing my database. So I would describe them, I would measure them, I would photograph them. And so that would be good for me, but also be good for the British Museum, because they would be able to put up that information on their online database as well. And that would be a major step forward in my process of publication.
Yeah, I can join you right there, hoping to get into the British Museum. It seems that all roads lead to the British Museum in terms of
inevitably.
And it's a good point that a lot of the times when we want things to be photographed or we want to photograph them ourselves, our hope is that they go online and that everyone can see them.
Absolutely, because I mean that's really my hope for the future as well. So the database that I've assembled, I hope to work out with all of the museums, because of course the copyright is still theirs, but I hope that at some point I can work out an agreement that this database could entirely be online for everyone to see, because I mean it's such a dump of information that can be used for so many things, because Mentuhotep II, as you yourself know, is such an important figure for Egyptian history, and his monument is really like the start of those monumental mortuary temples that we have around Luxor. For example, Hatshepsut's temple is heavily inspired on it. So yeah, I think it will be worth the time, the effort, and I think that a lot of scholars might profit from it, or at least I hope so.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Making things available online, letting people see, your reconstruction, what you found out. That's always such a valuable part of research.
Absolutely.
And so I think we have some audience questions
perfect.
About your research. Yes, okay. So Asexual Atheist asks, how are you analyzing and grouping these fragments, and what do you know about them so far?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you for that. So the first step is just the physical description of them. So I'm describing them, what I see, I'm measuring them, and I'm photographing them just for the record. And so the process that I'm following in order to try and reconstruct them within a larger scene is threefold. So I look at archival material, hoping that some of the original excavators from the 20th century, the early 20th century, actually might have had some notes about where they found specific fragments. Usually I'm very disappointed in that because they didn't. But I mean, sometimes something can be gleaned from it. And then the second step is, as I said, I compare the fragments that I have or that I'm looking at with other fragments from the same temple. So I go to the database and I look for different themes. For example, I have a fragment that depicts a soldier. So I'm going to look to all of the other fragments that depict soldiers to see if they're stylistically the same, to see if there are physical joins between them. That would be ideal. Again, very disappointing. I haven't been able to find one physical join in all of those fragments, I believe. And so that's the second step, see what kind of like goes together. But the problem is that this temple is so destroyed that we actually have to go and look at other monuments, specifically, or sorry, more importantly, from the time itself, if possible, or older, so from the period before that. Because decoration, I mean, it changes over time, obviously, but there are a lot of standard themes in Egyptian temples. So, for example, if I have a crocodile, I can go to another monument and see that the crocodiles probably always come in like a marsh scene, so hunting in the marshes, in a kind of like riverine setting. So when looking at other monuments, I might have an idea of what the actual bigger scene look like, and then I can try and put other fragments from that temple inside in order to be, to reconstruct it.
Yeah, the curse of the joins, right?
Yes, exactly. It is so frustrating yet so enjoyable.
So we have another question about Reconstruction from Jim Majors. During Reconstruction, do you experience any difficulties caused by earlier preservation methods or poor scholarship?
Yeah, so this is a big problem. The thing is that I'm not able, I wish I could, but I'm not able to physically reconstruct the temple and the decoration inside, because all of these fragments are, not all of them, but most of them are now spread out over museums all over the world. We're talking about North America, Europe, Japan, and also in Egypt. So it's actually currently impossible to physically bring that monument back together. But what I hope, and that's actually one of the difficulties caused by earlier scholarship, because at the time objects were just removed from Egypt. But what I hope is to use digital reconstruction methods in order to build that model in a digital way. And I think that actually a lot more people, there's another question coming up about 3D scanners. Maybe yeah. I can tie that into it already. So yes, 3D scanners and 3D models would be the way forward to reconstruct that temple. And so that's what I've been doing as well. So I've been using photogrammetry, which is a method where you take pictures and basically simply put it in a software, and it creates 3D models for you. And so what I hope to do is to have a 3D model of the actual building and then put the decoration on the wall, because I think that it's so important that we bring that temple back together, not only for people everywhere in the world, but also people from Egypt who are not all of them are able to travel all over the world if they wish to see the fragments of Mentuhotep II. So I think that maybe a local project in Luxor, I think, would be a great way to show what we have in 3D model options to the local public. And of course, I mean, the World Wide Web is endless for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, one more question about how many variables do they intake for these manuscripts? A few quantitative ones were mentioned. I'd love to hear more detail.
Yes, that is a very good question. I don't think that they have a limit that you have to be above that amount of variables. very interesting question, though. I should check that with the publisher, but I don't think that they have a certain limit. I myself try to be as accurate as possible. That's why I haven't published yet, because I don't have all of the fragments yet. And so I would like to go to the British Museum and really fill up the gaps that I have in the database.
Yeah, I mean, we try our best to make things as complete as possible, but
exactly. But the thing is, at some point you have to make a decision as well. Like, okay, do I choose to put the material out and say it's not complete, and hopefully someone else or myself in the future will be able to continue adding on what has already been put out there. So that's kind of the dilemma that I'm choosing between at the moment. But I try to be as complete as possible.
And that's always the goal. We hope to keep adding on to research. And we have one more question for you. So Hicken Grennan says, if you have time to ask, I would be interested in knowing what sort of data schema he uses to record the information on the fragments and what sort of data he captures.
That is a very interesting question indeed. So yeah, I think I understand. Sorry, it took me a while.
No problem.
So what I record really is, first of all, the measurements, because they will be proven very important to actually put them on the walls. So the scholar that I've mentioned before, Dieter Arnold, who is both an Egyptologist and an architect, was able to make reconstructions of the actual heights of the wall. So for example, if I am reconstructing certain fragments below each other or on top of each other, I can immediately see with the measurements that I get to see if something is possible or not. For example, there are column fragments in there, and based on measurements, I know that there are two types of decoration on those columns. And I know that specific elements that fit on one column don't fit on the other. So measurements are actually very important for that. The other thing that I record is the type of stone. So is it sandstone or limestone? Both are used in the temple. And actually, if you already know that, you can already kind of like pinpoint in which areas of the temple this specific piece of decoration might have been positioned. Sandstone was actually used in the back of the temple with sunk relief, which I talked about earlier, whereas limestone was used in the front of the temple. So we have measurements, we have the stone type, and then I also analyze the metadata in the sense of these are the numbers that have been used in museums, but also by the excavations, and use them in connection with archives to see what I can find out. As I said, usually that's not a lot, but those are the things that I've really been researching. Also, if there is text on the hieroglyphs, I'm translating it. I'm seeing if there are sentences that can be formed out of different fragments, and that's a huge help as well. So a lot of variables that are being recorded as much as possible.
Yeah, and it sounds like you certainly have a big project ahead of you, but the results are going to be fantastic, I am sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Research.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's a big project, but we'll get there step by step.
We believe in you on this.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind.
All right, thank you so much. So we're going to take another quick break, and we'll be back to update you on what's happening next soon.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to give you a very quick update. We've had a slight mix-up. Our next candidate actually has withdrawn and I completely forgot to write it down on the schedule. So my fault entirely, apologies. I've emailed our final candidate to see if they can join us early. So we will get that going just as soon as we can. Stick around if you're able. If you can't, then as always, the stream will be staying online so you can always check back later. Thank you.
Welcome back. Thank you so much to our next candidate who's been very flexible. And so now that she's here, I'll let her introduce herself. Can you tell us who you are and where you're studying?
Of course. Hi, my name is Sasha Rarick. I am an Egyptian archaeology PhD candidate at University of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois. And yeah, I'm technically in my 8th year of like combined MA PhD and looking at the end. So that's very exciting.
Well, we wish you luck as you come to the end. We know that this can be both the best and the worst time with a PhD.
Yeah.
But we're here to hear about your research. So what are your research interests?
Yeah, of course. So my kind of broader research interests are like domestication and animal husbandry and the ancient Near East, settlement archaeology, and kind of the link between production strategies, particularly as it relates to animals and animal production, to ancient economies. So my whole thing is zooarchaeology. I really love spending a lot of time looking at minute little bones from archaeological context. So that's always really exciting. And I've been working at, I think since 2015, the site of Tel Edfu, which is in the south of Egypt, a couple hours south of Luxor, and at the site of Dendera for a couple of years, looking at kind of the transition between the Old Kingdom and the First Intermediate period, specifically looking at how animals have changed, how their usage has changed, and how that reflects the evolution at these sites as well. So that's kind of the condensed version.
And Tell Edfu, that's Nadine Moller's site, yes?
Yes, yeah, she's my advisor.
Okay, for those of you who don't know, Nadine Moller, excellent Egyptologist, currently at Yale now.
Yes.
And so she runs the Tell Edfu site. And so just had to check my own knowledge. I'm not an Egyptologist, but.
No, you're good. Yeah, I think she's been running it since 2007, but then they started excavation on the area of the site that I work on in 2012, and then I came on in 2015. So it's been a wild ride. It's an amazing site. Like, they have archaeology at the site, like strata from the late 5th dynasty around like 2300 BC all the way up through the Ptolemaic period, which ends in 30 BC. So it's just like thousands of years at this one site, which is just like amazing.
Wow, that must be incredible to see all the different layers of occupation, and that probably means something very cool with your research, how you can see the relationship with animals changing.
Exactly. So I'm like, my dissertation specifically is looking at how, how animals were used and what animals were used, and kind of in what ratios from the late 5th dynasty, where the kind of earliest levels of occupation, into the first intermediate period, and seeing if and how that relates to the kind of textual narrative that we've got, where end of the Old Kingdom, there was like economic collapse and everything was terrible, and all these nomarchs were like, people were eating other people, but I stopped it. And we're kind of trying to see like, how real is that? And so it's really useful to look at animals and see like, all right, do we see a bunch of like human bones that have chew marks on them, which they don't, I promise. But just seeing like how the animal economy kind of changed, and if they move from a model where they're being provisioned by the state, and so maybe had like more cattle and like higher level meats like cattle and sheep and goat, or if they were fending more for themselves and had more sheep and goat, and also like pigs and wild fauna and fish. So it's been really interesting kind of collecting all this data. The last 5 years, I guess technically 4 or 5 seasons, collected about 14,000 records in my like gigantic Excel database. And I'm just kind of finally getting to the point where I'm like, okay, now I get to process all of that. So that's what this summer is going to be about. It's just results and conclusion, get that done.
This is like the day of intense databases, because you guys are
really
building these huge, amazing databases that will be so useful for not just your own research, but for other people's research, which is great to see happening in the field. And this work on archaeology is so fascinating. How did you get involved in this?
So in college, I took a class on zooarchaeology and really enjoyed it. But then I did my undergrad thesis on human remains from at Giza. So just like all of the kind of elite mastabas there, a bunch of the human remains that actually under George Reisner in the early 1900s been taken to the Peabody Museum at Harvard. And so I was able to get access to those, which was incredible. And I thought like, oh, I'll keep doing human things. And when I got to grad school, Nadine was like, hey, we don't have any humans, but we have a ton of animal bones. And I was like, I'll take them, dibs. So that was really awesome. And so yeah, my love for zooarchaeology kind of was started early, and then just got nurtured having like an entire site where they were like, go forth and analyze. And weirdly, I am in love with my Excel database. It's a very love-hate relationship, but mostly love, which is good.
There's nothing quite like the beauty of looking at a database and being like, I made this, look at this thing.
Yeah. Like, it's wonderful. It all came together. But yeah, so that was kind of zooarchaeology. And I, my undergrad thesis was also on Egyptian archaeology. So I kind of fell into that, which was just like the most wonderful serendipitous thing. Like, as I was switching majors into archaeology, they happened to hire Peter Damanwelian to be like the Egyptologist on campus. And I was like, hey, be my thesis advisor. So that just worked out really wonderfully and kind of all came together at EdFu. And yeah, just fell in love with bones.
That's awesome. And so now, the big question that everyone wants to know, what are your specific summer plans, and how do you think the HAPS Fund can help you achieve your goals?
Yeah, so my goals for the summer are basically to finish up a complete draft of my dissertation. I have lots of pieces of chapters. Most of the background chapters are done, but the big one is, results, conclusion, discussion. And I have been working with my advisor, and she, just transitioned to a new university. So it's been, hard getting access to all of our database information from EdFu. So now that we have that, it's kind of it's go time. Going to spend the summer basically taking all the information from my personal database for the animal bones, comparing it to all of the archaeological information from our like overarching EDFU database, and coming up with grander conclusions that ideally will help contribute to a field of knowledge that is broader in the Near East. Like zooarchaeological studies have been going on in, outside of Egypt in what we think of more, I guess, as the Near East or modern day Middle East. For longer than they have been in Egypt. There's been a couple people in Egypt, like Salima Ikram at American University Cairo, and oh gosh, I'm blanking right now, Richard Redding, who is at University of Ann Arbor, and like a number of other people as well. But it's just, it hasn't been as big of a focus to look at the animal bones as it has been, for, as has been the case in a lot of Egyptian studies, like looking at all like the grander monuments and the temples and the tombs, and those are incredible, but looking at daily life hasn't just been as big of a focus. So in recent years, maybe the past like 2 decades, zooarchaeological studies have really started coming into their own. And so I'm hoping to contribute to kind of that somewhat smaller field of knowledge right now, and kind of bring this perspective from southern Egypt, which hasn't been nearly as studied, especially for settlements like the Delta. Since the Old Kingdom, like core of power was at Memphis, and so that area has been studied a lot more in detail. But yeah, Upper Egypt just hasn't got the same love and attention. So hoping that this study will also help kind of bring more visibility to zooarchaeological and settlement archaeology studies in southern Egypt, and contribute to that kind of broader realm of scholarship.
Yeah, this sounds like such an important project. To remind people that history isn't just, kings and nobles. There's everyone else who, built this space, contributed to its history.
Exactly.
Life.
Yeah, and we've learned so much from it. I mean, even at Giza, a site that's been studied for so long, it's been in the last 15 years, I think, that Mark Lenner and his like incredible team discovered that it wasn't slaves who were building the temples, it was, or the pyramids, it was like corvée labor, people who were brought in and paid for their work. And they could see that from the archaeology, and Richard Redding's work on the animal remains from Giza did an incredible job with the workers' village of showing they were getting feed mostly cattle and sheep and goats, and they didn't have much having to fend for themselves, which was a big light bulb moment for a lot of Egyptologists and archaeologists in general, just being oh, this was something that we weren't looking at. We were looking at the pyramids because it was right there, but it was the people who were living around the pyramids, and not the pyramids themselves or the mastabas and the tombs. So work like that has a big impact on understanding the society as a whole, because let's be real, ancient Egyptian kings didn't always be the most honest in their retellings of how things were. So kind of digging into the archaeology gives us a more realistic perspective of what was happening.
Yeah, definitely. And this is such fascinating, important work. And I am sure that we have some questions from the audience, because I know I have a bunch. So Majors asks, how did animal husbandry practices along the Nile, such as settlements like Edfu, differ from animal husbandry practices east of the Nile?
Ooh, interesting. So I can't speak to necessarily when you say east of the Nile, I'm not sure if you mean far east or if you mean within Egypt. But if we're talking about within Egypt, the Eastern Desert versus along the Nile or the Western Desert, we definitely see obviously much more fish for those who are, not necessarily husbandry, but a lot more kind of wild hunting of animals along the Nile for those settlements that are directly along it. And as you move further away from the Nile, you end up getting more animals that you can herd. So pigs, you don't necessarily find as much away from the Nile, because they don't travel well. They get too hot because they don't sweat. And so you don't end up having pigs as much in places that are further removed from areas that's more conducive to their natural habitat. So you end up getting, sheep and goat are really common in the deserts, just because you can herd them a lot more easily, especially if you get them to an oasis, and then it's okay, great, we can all just settle down here for a while. And then obviously more wild fauna come in. So they'll be hunting gazelles and other kind of deer adjacent animals in those areas. And then you even find things like hippo come into play, not so often, away from the Nile, but that was something that was incredible, is that at Edfu, I found in the Old Kingdom levels, 24 hippo bones, I think 5 of which came from one individual and from another, and at least 2 individuals were juveniles. They were young hippos that had evidence of burning and butchery. So they were eating young hippos, even though that doesn't show up anywhere in the texts. So really incredible stuff.
What has
I
been the
hope
most
that answered your question.
Oh, I think you did a great job answering the question. So you mentioned sort of this like mismatch between what you're finding in the archaeology and what the texts are saying. What has been the most sort of surprising thing that you've uncovered in your research?
Oh, I mean, definitely the hippos. My first year, I remember finding a few of them and was very confused. Like since I'm working in the lower strata, the older period, they had actually excavated a couple years before a male hippo skull from like an abandoned silo from the second intermediate period. And they were like, hey, I don't know, maybe there's more hippos, or maybe there's just this like one random hippo that they killed or they found and they kept the skull for some reason. And then as we actually did more excavation in the Old Kingdom, I found so many more like juvenile hippo bones with cut marks. And I was like, okay, my master's thesis was looking at like hippos in ancient Egypt, and I was not finding any textual evidence of like eating hippos anywhere. It was always like they'd be hunted for sport, especially in the Old Kingdom by the nobles and the king, but they never mentioned like, oh yeah, we hunted it and then we took it back and like ate it. But it makes sense. Like if you already have all this meat, why let that go to waste? And also hippos were like a very big problem for crops. They would just kind of come through and wipe out entire crop fields. So they might have ended up having to kill it to protect their crops, and then we're like, well, can't let this go to waste. But yeah, it's all very conjectural right now, but excited to do some more research and see if we see hippos continuously at Edfu throughout all of those strata, or if it's just like the Old Kingdom and then disappears. So exciting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, we can't wait to see what you come up with. And what I've been impressed with throughout our conversation is your knowledge of just animals in general, like animal behavior today and what they do, and how much of that is part of your research, sort of bridging the ancient animals with the modern animals.
It comes in, especially like kind of on the front end, on the background research, just like learning, how was it that they ended up doing animal husbandry? Because I wasn't particularly familiar with, like, I didn't grow up on a farm. My dad did, and he was like, don't do it. No offense to farmers, you're rocking it. But yeah, so I had to learn a little bit about it just to kind of get a better understanding of, if their production methods were changing. When I say production methods, like, are they raising cattle for their meat, or are they raising cattle for, secondary products like milk, so that they can, make that into cheeses or just keep it as milk or yogurts or something. And then same for like sheep and goats. Like, are they raising these more for particularly sheep, like for the wool, or are they raising it more for meat or something else? Are they tanning the hides? So just trying to kind of get a better idea of how those things take place now. And the really interesting thing is that in modern day Egypt, they're in, like, especially in like smaller villages, like outside of Cairo and Luxor, like those places are going to be much more modernized. But in some of the smaller, more agrarian villages, they'll still see, like, they'll just kind of let their sheep and goat kind of hang out, particularly goats just like hang out in this particular field, and they'll bring them back in at night. And like the pens they use are really similar because they're just pretty basic and you don't need a whole lot to keep any sheep and goat. And so it's just like some of the husbandry practices are identical to what we think they were in the past. So it's definitely informative for me just to have a better understanding of how these animals are kept in modern times. But then in some cases it's very similar to the past, and so it's useful even if it's not like directly what my research is focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and thank you for answering my question.
Yeah.
Before we let you go, we have one more question.
Okay.
So, our channel asks, we're here to enjoy everyone's research. So can you see a difference between animals slaughtered for food and animals slaughtered for sacrifice?
Ooh, interesting. So I think it probably depends on who's doing the slaughtering. If you're a more practiced butcher, you're just not going to leave as many like butchery marks on an individual, like, as you're cutting things up. You're just going to be better at it than, if it's someone who doesn't do butchery all the time, but can do it in a pinch. If someone's doing it for themselves or their family or like their immediate, group, but they're not like a professional butcher, you're probably going to see a lot more kind of like hack marks in various parts of the bones you're not going to see in like a professional butcher, which would probably be the case if you were having a butcher for the royal palace or particular elite house. You're going to have people who are potentially better qualified at that than just your everyday, random Egyptian person in the past. But I'm not sure that beyond that, there's much of a difference that you can see other than archaeological context. So where you end up finding those bones, if they're like in a pit buried underneath, the corner of a temple wall, very likely that had something to do with, ritual deposits and maybe like feasting that had to do with like the construction of this temple, as opposed to, butchered remains that are kind of left in the street because in ancient Egypt, trash just kind of got swept out of the house into the street, and that's why we get to find it, which is, useful for us. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering the questions. We are at time, so thank you for your flexibility for coming on early. Thank you for sharing your research and for answering questions, and best of luck as you finish your dissertation.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me. Have a good one.
All right, so that concludes this round of interviews for Egyptologists. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for your excellent questions. We love having our candidates answer them for you. Our interviews of Egyptologists are not yet done, so please come back tomorrow morning and join Megan at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time to hear some more Egyptology research. Thank you again for joining us.